Today we have a rare treat, everybody. Extra Credits is talking about one of the most famous romance books in all of English literature. A love story so famous, it has rivaled Romeo and Juliet itself in terms of memorability. Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen is a story that I think does a fantastic job of keeping in line with its title. It's a story about romance, yes, but it's also a story that does something unique. Most star-crossed lover stories or Hallmark Channel movies tend to have the lovers struggle to get together because of outside influence, but one of the big factors in this book is that the outside influence alone isn't the only problem, but it's the characters' own pride in themselves and their positions and prejudice against each other that keeps them separated. Personal traits and issues are what keep the two apart, and they are factors that must be overcome for the characters to truly come together. It's a story I actually think Extra Credits could discuss well here, so let's see how they do.
Literature gives us the opportunity to experience lives, perspectives, and worlds different from our own. Though remember, friend, a good story has many readings, and this is but one. So imagine this. You're the second of 5 daughters in an upper-class English family, and your mother is obsessed with you marrying a very well-to-do gentleman. Luckily, you've recently met a very well-to-do gentleman. How fortuitous! But then, on the very day he proposes to you, you learn this dude wrecked your sister's engagement because he felt she was too low class. Oh man, what do you think you'd say to that guy? Well, that's not quite how Elizabeth put it in Pride and Prejudice. You know, the novel by Jane Austen. And here I thought the book was universally acknowledged. Today's literary discussion is brought to you by you, our lovely patrons over at patreon.com. Thanks so much for the support. So you haven't read Pride and Prejudice? Good gracious, only think, dear me! Well, its protagonists Elizabeth Bennet and Fitzwilliam Darcy are one of the most iconic pairings in all of literature. But what often gets lost in adaptations of this novel is how much of it was intended as satire of 19th century social conventions. So today, we're going to talk about Pride and Prejudice's famous romance, but also about its social and mathematical underpinnings. First up, as Elizabeth Bennet, you probably want to know, why is your upper-class family so cash poor?
Actually, no. What I want to know is, what the heck am I looking at? You've got this butch haircut girl playing the role of Elizabeth Bennet? Oh, that's going to be so distracting through the rest of this. Look, I get the whole thing about this show is that you try to insert the reader or listener into the role of the character, but a couple of problems. Number one, you don't do that in every video. In fact, in your very last one that we talked about, Beloved, you didn't do that. You spent the whole video guilt-tripping a white dude. Why didn't you make the white dude play the role of Paul D. or Sethi? You didn't do that. You just guilt-tripped him the whole video. So you don't do that in all your videos. Number two, you don't keep the person consistent. Like you made the Count of Monte Cristo a woman without changing the gender of anyone else in the story, so it was a little off-putting. And three, speaking of off-putting, it can be incredibly off-putting when you draw everyone else in the story as looking like they belong in the time period of, like, this time period of England, but you have the main character look like a modern-day dyed-hair buzz-cut girl. So when our main character Darcy shows up and says to her, "I don't think you're attractive enough to dance with," I have no reason to assume that he's wrong. I have no reason to look at Darcy and go, "I disagree with you." It's like when my brother went to go see a modern-day retelling of Julius Caesar by William Shakespeare, and all the characters were not only female, it was an all-female cast, but most looked like hipsters, trashy, and hoary, like whores, and they still talked in Shakespearean dialect, with the addition of dance numbers and all this other crap. It was incredibly weird. So it's also really off-putting when you don't keep things true to what they should be. But you know what? That's me nitpicking the way you drew this, but it is going to be very distracting. I'll try not to bring it up too often. Let's go. Let's get on with it.
Well, basically, Mr. Bennet's property earns enough interest for the family to live on, but not enough to accumulate savings. And this is doubly a problem because your pops has 5 daughters. Ordinarily, under English law, this estate would be split 5 ways after his death, leaving each of you without enough money to live on. But it gets worse, because the Bennet estate is entailed, meaning it can only be inherited by a male descendant. So when your father eventually dies, you girls get nothing at all, and even the house you live in goes to a cousin you've never met. Plus, as a final irony, the house is called Longbourn, meaning distant limit, which is exactly what you don't have. Your time limit in that house expires when your father does.
Can I just say how grossly inappropriate he made this look? Mr. Bennet, the father, actually cares very deeply about his daughters and didn't want them to just marry them off for financial security. It's in fact Mrs. Bennet who keeps trying to push this. But he demonstrates here, extra credits demonstrates that the father here is some kind of aloof doofus, just going, "I'll be gone someday," without a concern for Elizabeth or his family. That's not how he was portrayed in the book at all. In fact, near the end of the book, Elizabeth has to work hard to convince her father that she's marrying Mr. Darcy for love and not position, because that was his fear. He was really worried that his daughters would just get married to people they didn't like and not know love. She has to convince him, no, daddy, I'm actually marrying Mr. Darcy because I love him. So, poor representation on the father here, but let's keep going.
With this in mind, it's no wonder that your mother, Mrs. Bennet, is kind of obsessed with finding you girls suitably wealthy husbands to ensure you'll be able to live comfortable lives. What sounds like trivial gossip to the men in the novel is literally a matter of life and death for her family. In fact, if we look at Pride and Prejudice's iconic and ironic opening line, the language is suspiciously similar to other major declarations from the Enlightenment. Austen uses this highfalutin language of universal truths for comic effect and to underscore Mrs. Bennet's ridiculous views on courtship. But underneath the laughter is a serious point. For girls like the Bennets, marriage is the only viable path to economic security. Absurd, but true.
Okay, let's talk about this because it's not being very fair. First of all, you're kind of failing as an educator here. You reference the famous opening line, but you're not telling the audience what it is. You're not even telling us what the line is. The line is, quote, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife," end quote. And he's right. There is a twist of irony to this quote, and it is a subtle jab at the reality of courtship and relationship of the time. But let's talk about the absurdity of it, as you call it. In our modern day understanding of rules, fairness, and legality, it does seem insanely inappropriate that women had little control of their lives. But this is also the 18th to 19th century. Times and social norms are incredibly different, and marriage was not always for love, but for social standing and financial security. The joke of the opening line is that a man with a lot of money must want a wife, when in reality, it's the reverse. A woman wants a husband with a lot of money, but it's also true that a man with good fortune should want a wife because a wife can maintain his property and provide an heir to secure the property. It's a truth universally acknowledged because it's a standard of the time based on societal rules, but not based on reality of desire. Women and men who both want to marry for love often find that they are in contrast with a society and a way of the world that doesn't allow for that. It's not really the fault of men or women, but a product of a time period where financial and social security was essential for survival. I'm just keeping all things fair. They didn't really say anything inappropriate there, but just saying that it was absurdity. To our mindset of this time period, yes, it is absurd. Back then, it made more sense to the people who lived then.
Furthermore, a vexing math problem heightens the stakes. There's a man shortage going round, y'all. The novel identifies at least 12 young women in want of a husband, but only 5 young men in want of wives. And in the background, a war is going on, so any given young man might be picked off by Napoleon before he can pick a wife. So when a rich bachelor, Charles Bingley, moves into town, Mrs. Bennet is full of hope that he'll want to marry her eldest daughter, Jane. Sure enough, Mr. Bingley and Jane meet at a ball and take an instant liking to each other. Yes! But the really important thing here is that you, Elizabeth, meet Mr. Bingley's BFF, the fabulously wealthy Fitzwilliam Darcy. He is haughty and full of pride, which of course leaves you feeling immediately prejudiced against him. In fact, Darcy tells you, to your face, that he won't dance with you because you're not, quote, handsome enough. Ha! Oh yeah, no, swiping left on that guy. Your other suitor, though, is Mr. Collins, none other than that distant cousin who's the heir to your father's estate, and marrying him would prevent your whole family from homelessness. Unfortunately, he's a pompous ass, so when he proposes, you don't think twice about saying no.
Okay, yes, it's true, Mr. Collins is a pompous moron, but let's take something for context for a minute. One thing I'd like to add is that when he proposes to Elizabeth and she rejects him, Elizabeth's father is actually relieved by this. The father is happy. Again, you kind of did the dad dirt at the beginning, buddy. Like, I don't know why you did that, but you did that.
He ends up marrying your friend Charlotte, who also finds him tedious and awful, but who is relieved to be guaranteed a comfortable future. You, however, are aghast that she'd choose wealth over love. Of course, in Regency England, not every woman had that choice to make. In fact, it's no coincidence that the courtship rituals Austen describes are strictly among the privileged classes, to which Austen herself belonged. Like Elizabeth Bennet, Austen belonged to a large upper-class but cash-poor family. And also like Elizabeth, she turned down a potentially advantageous marriage proposal because the guy was a colossal bore. As a result, Austen never married and knew firsthand the precarity of being a single woman of little property. And if you want to learn more about how her life influenced her writing, we've got a whole extra history episode on Austen waiting for you once we finish talking about this book. Speaking of, back at Longbourn, things have taken an unfortunate turn. Mr. Bingley breaks off contact with Jane and moves to London. Your sister is heartbroken, and you're furious. A fury that only increases when you later learn that the pompous Mr. Darcy is the one who convinced Mr. Bingley to avoid a, quote, undesirable match with Jane.
Okay, alright, so this might seem a little confusing, but for those who aren't following, let me fill you in. Jane, Elizabeth's older sister, was in love with Mr. Bingley. Now here, Mr. Bingley is suddenly going home to London with his family and were never to return. And Elizabeth later learns that it was Mr. Darcy who encouraged him to break off the relationship. This is what Elizabeth is upset about because she doesn't know the reason why he broke it off and thinks it's because he's an arrogant blowhard. So far, Extra Credits has explained this well, but let's see if he provides the context.
Which makes it super awkward when Darcy finds himself falling in love with you. Okay, let's back up. You go to visit Charlotte and her new, tedious and awful husband, who works for the haughty and self-absorbed Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who is Mr. Darcy's cousin, so you end up spending a lot of time socializing with him. But without your embarrassing mother around, Mr. Darcy suddenly notices that you're smart, funny, and actually quite handsome enough to dance with.
This goes back to my point earlier. You chose a very poor character model to play Elizabeth. I don't think Darcy would want to dance with a girl who looked like that. And frankly, I don't think she's the kind of girl who would want to dance with a man like Darcy. Just saying.
Then he confesses his newfound love in a marriage proposal that is simultaneously earnest and completely condescending. He admits he finds you irresistible, but it pains him to imagine your mother and sister as in-laws. Which of course is totally ironic because that's exactly why he encouraged Mr. Bingley to break it off with Jane.
I knew you wouldn't do it. Holy cow, I knew you wouldn't provide the context. Okay, explain this to me. Why does it seem that your goal here is to smear all the men in this book as bores? Just a bunch of self-interested, sexist pigs. But you're not giving them any humanity. Why aren't you giving them any kind of human traits or characteristics? Mr. Darcy explains that he encouraged Jane and Bingley's breakup because Jane was becoming incredibly clingy and the family was acting incredibly desperate. They were throwing Jane at Bingley as if desperately trying to get them together for his fortune and status rather than out of love or consideration of who he was. Remember, Mrs. Bennet is all about getting a financially secure future for her daughters. That's why he doesn't like Mrs. Bingley. That's why he doesn't like the family. Because they're desperate individuals just looking for money and financial security rather than love. He thought the match would be bad because he felt it was only built on financial gain, not a real relationship. Isn't that what you were criticizing earlier, guys? Weren't you literally just saying how sad it is that back in this time period, people didn't marry for love? Well, Darcy was thinking about love. He had always been thinking about love. Remember why he didn't dance with Elizabeth at the ball? Because she wasn't attractive enough? That was just an excuse, although granted, given the way you drew her here, I can agree with them, but it's revealed here that he actually just couldn't stand her mother, who was too desperate, clingy, and hungry for financial security more than she was in love. Now that he could see Elizabeth away from her mother, he saw her for the beautiful and kind girl she really was. He broke off the engagement with Bingley and Jane because of the behavior of Jane and her family in the whole affair. But you don't talk about this. You don't mention any of this. You just make it sound like he was always just an absolute jerk until Elizabeth changed his ways. God.
So you turn him down and let him have it with the full force of your wit. Darcy is dejected, but his love undiminished. So he starts working behind the scenes to patch things up between Bingley and Jane, who end up married. Not to mention, he helps rescue your sister Lydia from the nefarious plans of a local grifter. Furthermore, when you finally visit his estate, Darcy's servants tell you he's kind of a righteous dude. Oh man, are you starting to regret your decision without first getting to really know him / seeing his enormous, tastefully furnished and financially secure estate? Maybe.
Okay, you did better here, but let's talk a bit more about that. The grifter you're talking about is a British officer named Wickham, who eloped with Lydia. You see, Wickham originally proposed to Elizabeth after Collins, but she turned him down. And Wickham tells a lie that Darcy shamed him in the past, further adding to Elizabeth's prejudice against him. Turns out later, though, Darcy explains in a letter to Elizabeth that Wickham had caused his own downfall and refused the assistance Darcy had offered him in the past. Wickham has always held a kind of grudge against Darcy since then. Now, Wickham eloped with Lydia, who brought shame to the family name because at that point in time in history, it was very inappropriate to run away without marrying. Why would this bring shame to the family name? Because it might make any other potential suitors not want to marry the sisters because it would make their own families look bad. If they learn, oh wow, you had a sister who ran away with another man, that's a black stand on your family record. If anyone out there has ever watched Downton Abbey, you're starting to notice a lot of similarities. There's a reason for that. Now, Darcy pursued and made Wickham take responsibility and marry Lydia to save the family name, which he did at great financial and personal risk, mind you. He also brought Bingley back because he realized Jane did love Bingley, and it had been his mistake based on the actions of the family, not Jane. He was fixing his previous mistake based on a past misunderstanding. None of what he did was based on prejudice against the lower class, against women, or against Elizabeth. In reality, he's actually a man who cared very much about his buddy Bingley and didn't want him to get into a relationship that might hurt him, and he also was a person who cared deeply about others but didn't want his own life or other people's lives ruined just for financial gain or scrutiny. Yes, X credits here is right in acknowledging that Elizabeth had rushed to judgment and had established prejudice that skewed how she viewed Darcy. But imagine for a minute that you had never read this novel. Imagine you just took what extra credits said to be true. Why would you assume that she was ever wrong about Darcy in the first place? Based on what extra credit says, it looks like what happened was Darcy was a cold, prejudiced bastard who fell in love now with Elizabeth and was now trying to do good deeds because he loved Elizabeth and wanted to win her affection. Extra credits doesn't explore Darcy as a character, what all good things he's done previously, or the context behind his previous actions. It makes Darcy look like an asshole desperate to redeem himself for the sake of some snoo-snoo, and it makes Elizabeth look petty to just forgive some guy because he has lots of money and he did a few nice things for her. Just look at the way they phrase it. They never bring up the actual context behind why Darcy didn't like her family, or why he tried to break off the relationship with Bingley and Jane, nor does he bring up the letter received by Elizabeth that explained all this, because she has learned nothing about Darcy as a person outside of the simping moments he did for her. As far as she knows, again, based on what extra credits has shown us, as far as she knows, he's just a rich, simping asshole who is trying to turn over a new leaf just to win her over. And she's just going for it now because, as you pointed out in your own summary, he's rich and good looking. You've made Darcy look like a simping white knight trying to turn over a new leaf, and Elizabeth look like a petty bitch. Way to make both characters look terrible. And I don't just mean in art.
All right, based on all this new information, what would you say if he proposed again? Exactly. Nice. You both end up deliriously happy in your marriage, and Mrs. Bennet celebrates. And even though we, the reader, were invited to mock Mrs. Bennet's cringy views on marriage, we also celebrate and end up literally on the same page with her about the novel's happy ending. Which, might just make us wonder if all that stuff about universal truths was such an exaggeration after all.
Yes, very good. That's exactly right. The novel makes us question the irony and joking nature of the statement. When we first open the book, we immediately think that it's going to be a joke, a sexist story about how men are not truly in pursuit of women and how financially well-off men can have their pick of the crop while women must work hard to win affection. But it turns this on its head, showing that the man in the story isn't like the others. He wasn't in search of a woman, and as much as he was in search of love, and it was through Pride and Prejudice that the two finally start to come together. And it is through trials that love must be found, which is a universal truth. You know what? I may crap on you quite a lot, extra credits, but when you do right, I gotta acknowledge it too. Great job there. Good job.
Not to mention, if we check the math again, of the 5 eligible bachelors in the book, 3 have married Bennet daughters, and only one of them was a grifter, so I'd call that a win. As we say in our intro, a good story has many readings, and one of the things that signifies this book's greatness is precisely how many readings it can have. Seriously, getting lost in this one is a must, even if it's just to see which elements you latch onto. Plus, you'll discover why Jane Austen's delightful use of language, rich character development, and cutting humor has earned Pride and Prejudice new fans in every generation. And that is a truth that's universally acknowledged.
Okay, I have to be fair here and say that this wasn't the worst one extra credits has ever done, but I still notice some common issues in these videos. First of all, You can't decide what you want to do in terms of style for this series. Are you taking your listener through the story by inserting them as a character, or are you just summarizing the story to them? If you really want to keep this show consistent, you need to pick one or the other. Are you discussing themes, or are you leaving it up to interpretation? For example, in some, like Dracula, you talk about themes nonstop. In this one, you talk about what Jane Austen's personal life mattered to the story. But with stuff like Beloved, you try to leave the themes separate and tell us to read it ourselves. Also, why in this video do you treat every man as a sextus and pompous bore except Darcy at the very end, and he only isn't a bore in the end because you made him redeem himself? You don't explore Darcy as a character, even though we learn a great deal about him. You only talk about him as an egotistical ass until the end, where he's in love with Elizabeth and decides to turn himself around. But that's not the case in the actual story. The story is about two lovers blinded by both pride and prejudice. Darcy wasn't a bad person, but he saw the Bennet family as desperate, not seeking love or compassion, but just clingy financial gain, which he saw as distasteful, while Elizabeth saw him as an arrogant jerk who thought little of anyone other than himself. We learn later he's not really that. He actually cares dearly about his friends, and the people who spoke ill of him were usually people who were jealous of him or had refused his help in the past and were now worse off for it. The two had to learn to remove their pride and prejudice to see what was underneath. But you don't address Darcy as a character. You treat him like Ebenezer Scrooge, a character who was irredeemable until he found a reason to be redeemed. But Darcy, honestly, is a bit more like Severus Snape, a character we misunderstood until the very end when we learned what kind of man he really was. I feel with just a bit more fairness and a little less prejudice, extra credits might have done a better job here. But that would require them to have a bit of self-awareness, and I wonder if they have that at all times. But again, this wasn't their worst. Just a bit off-putting. Thank you guys for watching this one. And I look forward to seeing you in my next video. Take care.